Hello and welcome everybody to our webinar today. My name is Frederica. I'm the community manager here with UPRI, and I'm actually checking in from our Raleigh office here in North Carolina. So yeah, just as a brief introduction to the webinar, we would just love to hear where you guys are checking in from, which countries you're tuning in from, and seeing which countries are represented. We love to kind of follow that along. There's a lot of familiar names on the attendees list, so it's always good to see some good friends of UPRI checking in for the webinar. So yeah, if you don't mind, just let us know which countries you're checking in from. Hello, Alessandro, also a familiar name from Italy. So yeah, good to see both some Americans and some Europeans checking in. That's good to see. I won't be taking too much of your time. I'll let Jacob and Anders do their thing as they do it so well. But yeah, I have heard a rumor that we have a little bit of a new interesting element today. So I'll leave with that teaser and let you guys take it from here.
Thank you so much, Frederick, and we are absolutely excited to for today's topic. It's one of our brand new topics. I would say we've never had a webinar based on user requirement specifications before, but it's one of those things where we always, with our validation team, go out and need to do perform a temperature mapping or a qualification, and that is based on a URS. So we've seen hundreds of different user requirement specifications, and therefore we also today we're going to try to summarize some of the findings that we have. We're going to baseline a little bit and try to look a little bit ahead as well on a more strategic direction. But yeah, the topic of today is designing a future-proof temperature monitoring and mapping URS. So we're really excited to get started, but I think first of all, just a small introduction. Who are we? So my name is Jacob, and I'm the head of quality here at UPRI. I oversee our quality management systems, our calibration laboratory, and also our validation team here. And together with me, I have Anders. Not a newcomer anymore. It's your second time around, right?
It's my second webinar. It's amazing. I don't feel like a rookie anymore.
No, no.
And I'll do my best to squeeze out all the knowledge we possibly can from Jacob today. I'm Anders Buchmann. I'm the Vice President of Commercial with UP, so I'm responsible for sales and marketing, meaning I lean in a lot at the moment on all of the larger enterprise accounts showing interest in our space in the temperature compliance space.
Absolutely. And just briefly, like why can we speak about this topic today? Why are we interesting to listen at?
Yeah, good question. So in short, UP, we have more than 10 years on our back at the moment. We are live in more than 50 countries at 6,000 locations. We do around 4 billion annual measurements, and we are the third largest calibration laboratory in Europe at the moment. So we've come quite a far way across mapping, monitoring, and validation, as you see on this. And we hope, in all modesty, that will be enough to share a little bit of our knowledge in the URS domain that you've prepared a lot for, Jacob.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, without further ado, what we're going to talk about today, basically the agenda points here. First of all, I'd love to baseline. We always do this at the beginning of our webinars. We're talking about the same things. We're sort of getting to the same understanding. And then we discussed a lot how should we approach this topic. This is rather new for us to present on, at least. And basically, we've broken it down to identifying the URS components, and we're talking about temperature monitoring and mapping. So again, with most of our webinars related to temperature and environmental monitoring and temperature measurements, we use a warehouse as an example, but this can basically be applied to all sorts of temperature control units. Most of today is going to be based on the ISPE guideline, which is controlled temperature chambers qualification, mapping, and monitoring, if I don't call if I call correctly. So we're going to talk a bit about the components, which sort of topics, elements are in URSs, and then we're going to take a more future look at how to define your URS points, because we got a lot of experience within the field with our customers where we do an initial mapping, and then a few years later or some time later, we need to redo a mapping because they ran into some of the pitfalls, and one of those is not really looking ahead. So we've picked out some of those topics, the most interesting ones where we see that having a strategic outlook on creating URSs could be beneficial. And then we've included a few examples along the way here. So just for good measure, I mean, we love comments, we love questions in the chat, and often we get a good debate started in the chat.
Yeah.
But at any point in time, just use the chat function in the system here, and we can see your questions, and we'll try to integrate them along the way. And we also do have some polls, but I think before we actually get started, there's a small new thing on this webinar.
Yeah, like Frederica kindly teased in the intro, we wanted to introduce a new format for this one, a little bit of a quiz just to get us started and get everybody at the edge of the chair before we start unloading all of the knowledge. So I think you can punch it live, Jacob. We made a little bit of a quiz with the question, which of the following elements is typically required in a URS for monitoring and mapping in GXP environments? And more importantly, that poll will be live, or the quiz will be live now, so you can answer. But there's a prize, right? Because after we started wearing these really nice UP vests all around, when we go and meet you around the world, there's been a lot of interest. So obviously, this needs to be the prize. So go ahead and answer. If we can, we'll pull out a winner during the webinar, and we'll contact you and make sure one in the right size will come in a parcel as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. So while that's going on, we're going to start on the topic here today. So first off, I think it's really important to understand where the URS comes into play in sort of the overall process of environmental monitoring and mapping. There is the ISPE guideline, which I strongly recommend buying. It's not very expensive, and it gives a really nice introduction. But that actually borrows a lot of the concepts from commissioning and qualification, which is also present on this small clip here from the ISPE guidelines. So basically, user requirement specifications are the first steps in trying to define what process or quality requirements you're wanting to achieve with, let's say, environmental controlled storage. So often, we won't go into too much detail with the following steps, but it's important to see the relation that after identifying your user requirement specifications, basically stating what is it you want this system, you could call it, to do, would often do like a system classification. Is it direct or indirect impact to our core parameters? Do a system risk assessment. So basically, based on the implications and the US, are there any sort of risks that need to be applied or anything we need to mitigate? You can go through design review and design qualifications. Want to go into much detail, but then we have the construction phase. Often we could see this as sort of a V model as well. Then you would often follow by a commissioning, so either a FAT SAT check, often for like standalone units, but it could also be we see a lot of customers replacing this with sort of an installation qualification, ensuring that it's installed. So if you have a warehouse, as an example, we've identified user requirements, we've identified the plans for how to make sure that we can store goods at, let's say, 2 to 8 degrees. And then we actually try to first verify that the equipment we've installed and which we've reviewed actually is installed as it should and per specifications. And then we start doing the verification of operational readiness or qualification. So that would be typically involve our mapping, but it can also involve other qualification steps. And then after that, we would do a release. But today we're going to focus in on the user requirements, because that's really the baseline for being able to perform a mapping, to be able to perform qualification or verification of these individual items.
Yeah. So maybe before passing on, I can see that there's a lot of engagement going on the quiz. So maybe that wasn't too bad of an idea. We'll come back to that. We'll keep the poll open for a minute. We did prepare one, and I want to throw that out there. Maybe it's a little bit cheeky, but maybe you can open up the poll that's called honestly, when do you actually do your URS? Because it's no secret we pull forward this specific topic for the webinars based off of what are the interest points in the conversations we are having out there right now with professionals like yourself. And the URS is a frequent guest, but also maybe a little bit of an understated one. And it does vary, to be honest. When the URS are actually done, so it would be interesting, and we'll treat this as confidential. It's more to inform the conversation here and your guidance, right, Jacob?
Absolutely. So one of the sort of the obvious pitfalls we do see a lot is that URSs are either not prepared or prepared rather late in the process, when actually going to, if we're talking warehouses, when actually going into the qualification stage. Whilst that can work, and we rarely see findings from authorities on this, it always leaves behind the risk of whether you start to form your user requirements on the stuff that you actually built, rather than actually having taken into account the processes and your requirements from the beginning, so that you have a more independent or more objective view on what you're actually trying to achieve. But that's also some of the things. So that might lead us on really nicely, actually. First of all, I want to get very clear in terms of who should be involved in writing a user requirement specification. So what we suggest and would always advise on is, of course, first of all, the quality team, having someone on board who understands the regulatory requirements, who can interpret the business needs into critical quality parameters or critical quality aspects. And having the business unit in as well. And that's also going to be more evident as we go along, because often you would have something that might be a business requirement in terms of the amount of volume that you want to be able to store, what the customer requirements are, and so forth. But again, one of the things that's often looked is having management in as part of writing the URS. Often what we see is that management has a very clear idea of the strategy for the company, where you want to go, which areas you want to expand into, but those are not translated into user requirement specifications. And some of those experiences led us to do this exact webinar, and having this strategic.
And what are the implications of not having management as part of this?
I'm very glad you asked. But yeah, exact. The implications that we often see is basically the title of our webinar, right? You have too short of you base your URS on your situation today rather than the situation tomorrow or in 5 or 10 years. And that's hopefully some of the items that we're going to cover today. Some of the things we see foreseeing could have an impact on how you write your URS.
Yeah, and I guess that's the underlying theme, because there's flexible in the topic for today. But behind that, in our conversations on how to bring this forward in the most relevant way, was that what you have to do when you're doing the URS is essentially to be able to tell the future. You can only speak it based off of the past.
Exactly.
So the only right way to sort of give yourself any room for success is to have some level of flexibility in, right?
Both flexibility, but also optionality, I would say, and scalability.
Sure.
Those are really important topics, and that's really what underlines, from my perspective, a good URS is that it's both compliant to the situation today, it fulfills the requirements of the situation today, but also that you build in a bit of foresight, being able to say, what if X, Y, Z, could we still include that into the URS without restricting us today, and what will enable us to move faster in the future?
What would be like a short, we know there's a lot of quality professionals participating in these webinars. What would be a short, good way to give out to you guys today on how to pull management forward and not only pique their interest, but actually block their calendars and assign time to this?
Really good question. I would say one way to consider writing a good URS and keeping the involvement would be a total cost of ownership, right? You can write a URS in such a way that the changes that you would have further down the line would cost less, because you accept that there is an opportunity that will arise in the future. And some of the topics that we'll cover today are like geopolitical changes, which can have an impact on the supply chain.
Sure.
Different items, would it be beneficial also from an economic standpoint to be able to scale up and down your operations, all those sorts of things. I think just as a small note here, we can see that there's a really good sort of even distribution between writing the URS before buying, as part of buying, or after buying. And this really closely resembles what we see out there, that it's not always that you get it done before, not that is necessarily needed. I'm just trying to find it.
While you search for that, so we had 23 correct answers on the quiz. We'll come back to that before ending the webinar and pulling out a winner.
Yeah,
I think you will be the lucky one to pull out a file number.
I'll make sure to do so. Okay, so first of all, especially in cases where we approach a customer who's not performed a URS or if not authored a URS. I think that's the best example of sort of being able to say what kind of items should you be thinking about. I would say often we would divide it into the categories. We have two slides here of categories. First of all would be capacity. That will often be business requirements, but basically what is the amount of area, if it's a one level plane, or amount of shelves that you want to be able to store in there. And in which areas, well, which type of storage should that be? Should it be in shelves, on floors and whatnot? It can also be a lot of things we often seen. It's quite funny, which is like spacing between shelves. And we had a very good case, I won't mention the customer, but where the spacing was chosen as narrow as possible, but then they realized at a later point that they would need a heavier loads, which means a larger forklift, which means it actually couldn't fit between the shelves anymore. The second topic is operational. So basically, what kind of room do you need for forklifts? Not only maybe for one, but for several if you need to change your operational. Also, separation of goods. We sometimes see a pitfall where you don't. A good example is like if you have drugs in your storage, how do you separate those? That actually can have an impact further down the line on whether you can store drugs, of course, or sensitive drugs. But also in the separation, like security-wise. Yeah. But it also does have an impact on how you test it, how you perform your mapping afterwards. It can be in terms of power backup. A lot of a lot of warehouses do have power backup systems, but some don't. And this will also impact your testing strategy or qualification strategy down the line. But also cleaning and service. And this is really one of the items where we see in a lot of cases where you have a company who would not normally be a GDP company, that they would have warehouses that are not really designed for cleaning as you would often expect in GDP. So remember that cleaning and cleanliness is actually a crucial part, and will most likely also be a requirement from a customer, that you keep the areas dust free and that you're able to clean these. So remember to put that in as well. The next set of topics are basically monitoring. You would often include in a URS for something like a warehouse that you have some specific requirements for control sensors. Yeah. This is not really part of the monitoring itself, but more the control. But one of the sort of pitfalls we see, and remember, this is basically a basic view, a baseline of how to create a URS report. Yeah. But having several control sensors can have an impact on whether you can control certain areas by themselves, or you need to control everything at once. And there's already a small hint in terms of one of the items that you could think about in terms of being able to scale up or down a business, or a storage area. If you have one really large area that can only have one temperature, it's really, really, really hard to anticipate when you have changing seasons, whether you need to turn up or down the temperature in some areas rather than not in others. So that's one of those items to keep an item out for. Another thing is actually a pitfall which I believe is based on a misconception that the placement of monitoring sensors should be described in the URS. We sometimes see that in the URS, it is described where monitoring sensors should be, constant monitoring sensors should be placed. And I know it says so in the example in the ISP guideline, but our basic approach is always that you do a URS in which you specify there should be monitoring in place and the minimum number of sensors you want for your constant monitoring. Then you go all the way through the different steps we saw before, you perform a mapping, and then you decide on where the best positions for constant monitoring are.
And Jacob, I'll not be the one asking the stupid questions. Yeah. So if not in the URS in terms of placement of monitoring sensors, where does that live then?
It lives in the mapping reports and the temperature and temperature/humidity mapping reports. Yeah. Because it's only when you have identified your hot and cold spots or other risk areas that you know where to place your constant monitoring. And this is a rather widespread misconception, in my opinion, that you would know where to place something in the beginning or very early on when you're describing your URS.
Yeah. And I can keep asking the stupid questions for the full hour, but if you have any stupid questions or really intelligent questions, just hammer away in the chat and I'll try and bring as many forward as I can for Jacob during the session.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next part is on engineering alarms, and that's also one of the places that we see a lot of times people will have put in the URS that you need engineering alarms on failures. That's fine. You should have engineering alarms on when the system is operating at over capacity, or whether there are doors that are not being closed. But actually, one of the things that we see performing really, really well is that you have engineering tendencies or engineering reports as part of your expectations for a system. So a good example of this would be cooling capacity. So let's say you have a cold storage, 2 to 8 degrees. You might have an engineering alarm that says now we are over 100% capacity on our HVAC system. But it would be much nicer to say we're at 85%, 86, 89, 89, 95%, so that we actually to foresee this tendency before something actually happens. So engineering alarms is one of those really important topics that we see from an operational standpoint.
Yeah.
Makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Safety, also one of the things that we're starting to see more and more being described in user requirement specifications. Basically, it doesn't have to be. I think it's often efficient just to have a set of expectations for the level of safety, especially if we're talking refurbished buildings.
Sure.
Because having a warehouse where you have previously had just a few employees, one in a forklift, one on the ground,
Yeah.
and suddenly starting to ramp up operations because it goes well, then the personal safety issues can become more of an issue. It's not so much to do with GXP compliance, but I think it should be a nice thing to add.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then from a process standpoint, we'd often have either the operating range, and this comes back to one of, or this brings forward to one of the points we'll have later on, is that we often see a storage area being specified only for the acceptable range, and that's why we have them as two separate points on this slide. One thing is saying the unit should operate for temperatures between 15 and 25 degrees. So that's fine, but I would rather specify that as the acceptable range or the nominal range.
Mm-hmm.
Having an operational range which is maybe 10 degrees to 30 degrees instead, if you know that the unit can handle it, so that doesn't matter that much.
Mm-hmm.
You're basically able to scale your operations up and down. So let's say you end up in scenarios where you find out that goods are coming in at a too high of a temperature because you had some sort of cold chain failure. Being able to cool down those products faster by changing those environments often can actually give a ton of flexibility.
Generally, when we talk ambience, we say 15 to 25.
Yeah.
So when you say operational range 10 to 30, so 5 below and 5 above.
Yes, something like that. It's just often we see equipment being spec'd at only where expected to use it. But having an operational range, which you of course then afterwards would verify or qualify, just gives you that flexibility up front. And that's also one of the key points we'll bring in later in the slides, is like over restricting yourself just because that is what you need today can sometimes backfire. So if you know that your, let's say it's a walk-in room, is capable of everything from 0 to 30 degrees, why not spec it as such so that later on you don't have to revise your user requirement specification just in order to use it slightly differently.
Yeah.
So there's actually a question here from Masood. What is the stacking height of boxes on a pallet if bulk products are stored in the warehouse instead of racks in a large cold room? So that really depends on your boxes. I would say often we don't see or have experienced that you would stack boxes directly on top of each other rather than just having pallet shelves.
Yeah.
But I might misunderstand the question. I'm sorry if that's the case. So just to give sort of a very basic example, this is directly from the ISPE Good Practice Guide, just to have an idea of what it actually looked like. Often we would specify our user requirement specifications by an ID number, unique ID number. A requirement would be the actual requirement, a type, and there, I have not mentioned this, but often you would differentiate between a quality user requirement specification or a quality need, a business need, or another need to sort of catch the risk, and then have a source of where did you arrive this requirement from. This should be a very simple table to create, but it gives a lot of nice features or a lot of nice context. First of all, that you have the source, so you understand where does it come from. Is it an existing policy that states that your warehouses should have such and such requirements, or is it a business need, or is it from an agreement with a customer? Where is it? And then, of course, the different requirements. So rather simple, and I would say as a good rule of thumb, having something like 30, maybe 40 different URSs should be more than enough, or should be your maximum actually for something like a warehouse, unless you specify it very rigorously.
So if we say 30 to 40 as maybe like a maximum,
Mm.
you mentioned quality and business, and that's two of the third. The third one was management we had in the beginning.
Yeah.
How many would they roughly take up out of, let's say, 30 to 40? What's the usual distribution here?
I would say typically you would divide between quality type and business type. I would say it's very difficult to state, but something like 50%. It's also dependent on how you identify it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, before we get started on sort of the further outlook, what are some of the best practices? So as we mentioned before, involve all stakeholders as early as possible. It's way easier to change something early on than later on. I think that goes for most processes in life, right? So often you would involve them early on in order to have all inputs. Another really important thing is really to consider what are nice to haves versus need to haves. So again, one of the topics that we'll discuss later on is basically what are the items that you need to have in order to be compliant and in order to service your process, and what are nice to haves. And often we find that there's a lot of nice to haves with nice to haves which are restricting your sort of operational range afterwards.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is system agnostics. So basically, user requirement specification should be written in such a way that it doesn't matter which system or which vendor or provider you use afterwards. It should be cover as many opportunities as possible so that you don't get locked up with a single vendor.
I guess that was a little bit one of the cheeky answering options we put into the quiz, that should it lead to only one vendor.
Yeah.
But in a linear timeline where you would usually go from the URS, then you go into your RFQ when you start sourcing your potential vendors, then you actually go into the final selection before going into building / operations, right? So what you're saying is you want a URS that opens up a process and doesn't limit a process early on, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So a really good question from Marianne here. What about a risk assessment? And Marianne, you're absolutely right. It's one of the things we had to cut out for today's webinar. I don't think anyone would accept a specification without, or a process without risk assessment. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for it today. But yeah, as you mentioned, it often assesses whether something is a need to have or a nice to have, or whether it's a business or a quality parameter. So absolutely. So there's another question.
And they came in with a really good one here,
Yeah.
actually just associated to what we talked about. If you would suggest to involve already some dealers and manufacturers, so from the sourcing part, already in the URS, referring to the timeline I kind of showed with my hands earlier, to avoid any back and forth by unrealistic requirements, or should it be an internal view only?
Really good question. And I would say going to either of those extremes often involves a bit of headache. So I think there's sort of different scenarios. A really good question, actually. There's often a bit of scenarios. If you choose to do it internally, I often see it going wrong if you do not have any prior experience.
Sure.
So if you are not informed, but you could also always say, well, prior experience, wouldn't that some sort of meaning that you have a vendor in the loop? It's just offline. So let me put it another way. You need to assess your requirements in the light of what vendors are capable of. So if you do have that past experience internally, I think no, it should be fine doing it internally. But if it's a new technology or new process or new business area, involving a vendor makes a really, really good sense. But relying solely on what the vendor provides does involve the risk of the vendor suggesting something that only their system is capable of without really being necessary.
So if I may build on René's question here, there is an unavoidable conundrum almost that you can only spec your URS from what you know, right?
Yeah,
So let's say you do have experience, actually, you feel somewhat comfortable going into the point you just said.
yeah,
You spec your URS, but how do you know like what you don't know? Because you want to open
Yeah,
it
exactly.
up for, let's say the old Henry Ford had he asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse and he gave them a car.
yeah,
So you can only spec for a faster horse because you don't know what the car is.
exactly.
So what to do here?
Exactly. I think one of the things I often suggest when dealing directly with customers on this issue is basically go look at a few different websites. They will often post the most sort of specifications for systems, and you would have a rather good understanding. Where I do see it going totally wrong is we from time to time we get customers asking for measurement uncertainty of 10 millikelvin. That is like almost to the level of a national meteorological institute. So, and it's never going to take you anywhere. But it's a really concrete example about specifications that don't make sense in the real world. I mean, from a theoretical standpoint, yeah, sure, they would make sense, but in any sort of practical application, having an incredibly low measurement uncertainty is not possible. It's not really. So I'm sorry for the no answer or for the non-answer, but basically a mix of those is often and that's where we see it going best. And the best cases we see are customers who've went out, looked at 3-4 different vendors. Maybe they need to talk to them, but sort of just looking at website specifications, gathered a rough idea of what they needed, went back, reviewed their own internal requirements in the light of what is possible, and took it from there. It's way more
There we go.
qualified.
Pretty tangible.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I think
Let's go back
yeah.
to the slide.
We'll go back to the slides.
Thank you for all
Thank you
the
very
good
much.
questions. Yeah.
So basically, looking at some of the pitfalls just in a typical user requirement specification phase. One of the things we're often seeing is as we talked about it just before, over specifying based on a current vendor or a single vendor.
Sure.
So René, your question came in really as a really nice transition here to this. Sometimes we see incredibly specific user requirement specifications for things that you cannot really rationalize from based on internal requirements. So having a system that runs on exactly 3 AA batteries does not make sense. You should, if you want a system that's wireless, you should have a battery powered system,
Sure.
a wireless system, rather than saying it should be exactly 3 AA batteries, right?
Yeah.
Another thing we're seeing often is that you do not take the process into account. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you have a warehouse, as an example, or a cold room, or freeze, or fridge, whatever it might be, you have a process with that, and you need to have a basic understanding of what your process is like. A great example of this is for fridges, for example. If you know you will be opening and closing the door 30 times a day, well, you should take that into account when specifying what the range of temperatures you are looking for, and whether it's even reasonable to expect that there are no deviations from your higher or low alarm or your acceptable ranges. You need to have that process in place as well with larger warehouses. How do you plan to people entering and leaving? What do you have long-term storage? Do you have intermediate storage zones and so forth? That's actually a very typical pitfall we see, is that we have a large warehouse. We're unloading goods from trucks before they're being placed on more permanent storage. And those areas have not been included as part, those temporary storage areas have not been included as part of your user requirement specification, in where you specify where or your capacity specifications. And then lastly, forgetting that there are general GXP requirements.
Sure.
I think this is very based on where which industry you typically and which companies you typically work in. But we do see people forgetting, or at least referencing, some internal requirements that mention GXP or let's say GDP in this example, or at least stating those. So do you have 21 CFR Part 11 requirements? Well, that should be in there if you're specifying your monitoring system. If you have a system that you're relying on in terms of being able to produce records, well, what are your good documentation practices regarding both the validation, the qualification, commissioning, but also afterwards when using the system, if you want to be able to use this data? What are the data integrity requirements for systems like this? I think that the best cases I see is where you'd have an internal good documentation practice, data integrity policy, and so forth, and you just reference it from there. That makes really good sense. But often we see systems that are where it's implied that there should be GXP compliance, but when these are handed over to someone who actually needs to conduct the reviews and conduct the qualification afterwards, if they can't see that that's a specific requirement, the likelihood that they're not going to at least qualify it is extremely high.
And I can see while you're talking, the attendance rate is actually going up, which is quite rare halfway in. So I don't know if you're pulling in colleagues because it's that good. But maybe let's do one more poll, Jacob, because I think that leans quite well up against the last 5 minutes of conversation. The one, which of these most apply to your current URS? I think that might give us a little bit of flavor also to share in the channel afterwards.
So just moving on. Okay, there's a question here from John Baldwin. So, which department would typically handle the first draft of a URS, quality or the subject matter experts on the topic, such as the validation team? Really good question, and I see all mixtures. We see all different types of mixtures, and I have yet to see any mixture of, as long as you have all the people involved and sort of the beginning of the project, it tends to go well. But I would say often I would actually suggest having the operational team involved, the ones that are, however you like to call it, but the people who are in charge of your operations if you're talking larger warehouses, because specifying something as simple as how large the room should be, both in order to drive in and out, like how often you'd want to go in and out with goods, how wide the entrance should be, the sort of different materials. Well, it's not hard to state what the temperature range is, for example, for something like this, but the feasibility of doing this is often really much related to how you plan to use the equipment.
And linking back to the second point, you're not taking the process into account. You gave the example that maybe you open and close doors 35 times a day. That would typically be the operational team that either knows or could foresee a change in use, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But then you need a key contribution from either validation or quality or whatever it might be that John correctly highlights.
So I mean, maybe it's another non-answer, but I think bringing everyone together sort of for a first draft, and one of the things we see going really, really well is when you keep the first meeting sort of non-formal, in the sense that we're not thinking about writing a URS, we're just merely having a conversation on, with this new extension or refurbishment, whatever, what are some of the considerations we should have? And then I think it's the quality team's responsibility to write that into a URS. A small, really good story that we had once was basically a client in which they instated a cold room. I can't remember if it's a cold or freeze room, doesn't matter, where quality had actually handled most of the stuff. The acceptable range, the URS, was well described. And then when we came on site and actually performed the mapping, we noticed that the door was too narrow to fit in a pallet. And then it's a really good example of this. It's a bit of tragic, but basically you really need to, I mean, one thing is we quality people like often, I can speak for myself at least, like to write things on piece of paper, stuff that looks good. But in the end, every single day, someone's going to use it and operate it.
So short answer, who takes the first draft? That's not a key meeting. Who would it be?
I would actually say, Doris, thank you very much for putting that comment right up there. I would say the owner of the process. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Answer, yeah.
So just moving a bit ahead, sorry. So we had this idea of saying, where do we see examples of URSs being written in a way that is really strategically thinking?
Yeah.
And we've gathered some of the some of the topics that we often see working really, really well. So starting out with the different topics, first of all, flexibility and adaptability.
Yeah.
So basically, are we going to foresee, and we saw it a lot during the Corona crisis,
Yes.
supply chain issues or geopolitical changes, or
Yeah.
how those might affect each other? How can that possibly have an impact on how we tend to use the facilities or the different processes we have? Should we be able to scale up or scale down, change the usage of certain areas and so forth? So that's one topic we see. Another thing is actually environmental impact. We do start seeing that more and more GMP customers are requesting some sort of environmental policy at least, and starting to actually wanting to report on numbers. So I have yet to see the first URS with an environmental impact section in
Sure.
it, but I'm pretty sure that it will come soon. And we hear a lot of people talking about it, like, should you have requirements to either being able to report on or being able to reduce your environmental impact? It's one of those tendencies that we see becoming more and more important. Changing regulatory expectations. So one thing is the level that you qualify for today, or the level of documentation you need from the different systems, the level of validation a monitoring system needs to have, for example. Is that something that's going to change over time? And we do see an increased, I think that the most prevalent industry right now is good distribution practice, where we see the demands and the requirements for GDP companies rising quite
Sure.
rapidly, especially in the US, where previously you would not need a GDP certification in order to transfer for a lot of the GMP companies, but we're starting to see this being the case.
That's actually a major change that's happening right now.
It's a really large change, and we're seeing it going at rocket speed right now, that more and more US, especially US-based companies in the GDP segment, starting to want to have a GDP certification, or at least a GDP attestation or something. Another trend we see a lot is more centralized control. So having these business insight centers also for quality parameters. Do you want to centralize, or in a few years, again, we're thinking strategically here, like 5+ years in the future, do we want to go from a place that we have today where we might have very on-site control, on-site control of the process, on-site quality oversight, or but in the future, do we want systems implemented which enable us to do that from remote? We're seeing a lot of international organizations where previously it was up to the local departments to control temperature, for example, and temperature specifically, and monitor and so forth, but where there are, maybe based on cost efficiency as well, the need to sort of centralize these controls. And that means that you have requirements for your monitoring system, for your control system, for your tendencies and so forth.
It usually start with cost, right? Then comes expertise, and then you see the notion of having a unified data landscape, basically, that enables you on a whole different level as an enterprise, as a big organization.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, sorry, just the last topic here before we move on, efficiency of operation. So basically, this is really, I think I can speak for all the quality people in the world, saying we really want efficiency of operation, but sometimes we see a lot of customers struggling to describe how do we plan for efficiency when writing our specifications. It's my view, it's UPR's view, that efficiency and derived specifications from efficiency are perfectly fine to put in your URS requirements. How would you like to handle deviations? How would you like to do all sorts of different things efficiently? Because if we handle stuff efficiently, we will also have more time to focus on the quality that actually matters often.
And you mentioned a little bit about a 5-year horizon. We can talk about thinking strategically without saying time horizon. How long time should a URS generally span or cover?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say something is wrong if you change it within 3 years often, like unless something changes, of course. URSs should be written in a way that they are viable for a long period of time. Because if you change your URS, if you update something or add something, you need to go through the cycle again, and that's another resource That's another resource usage.
Sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
On that note, should we publish the results of the last poll?
Yeah.
I think that might be
That
interesting
was
to lean
actually
up against here.
this one.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
great.
There we go.
So which of these most applies to your current URS? So it covers the basics and works wins. I like that. That's very good to hear.
That is pretty good to hear.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting, flexible as opposed to detailed. It's actually quite relatively close to each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
15 to
And
20
also, I
feet.
would like to say that when we bring up some examples for today, it's often some of the things where it didn't go so well, but we also do to a large degree see companies having really well control over this, right?
Sure.
So
Just a service message. You still have some pretty interesting slides to go. There's 12 minutes left of the webinar. We usually see a big concentration of interesting questions towards the end. So now's a really good time to start posting if you want to allow us to squeeze in the time to answer. But please go ahead, Jake.
Yeah. So basically, we try to drill down some examples of what this could be. So in terms of flexibility and adaptability, continuous mapping is really one of the key areas where we see, and we have another webinar on this topic specifically, but basically being able to do 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, a mapping allows you to be flexible in how you plan your operations, your layout, because you're constantly mapping. And that could be as well be a food for thought in terms of writing that in URS. Another, some great examples we have seen is actually also starting to require that your storage areas are segmented, like physically segmented. And that means that you'll be able to say, today you have one very large area, which is 15 to 25 degrees. Well, if you have it separated up, you could have, and most of the time in 15 to 25, but you could refurbish at a very rapid pace some areas to other types of storage. This is often more applicable to when building new buildings, but we've seen great examples of where you allow for future adaptability, rapid adaptability, by actually segmenting physically the different areas.
Yeah.
Another part we see in terms of environmental impacts is basically often this is related to energy consumption, right?
Sure.
But being able to deactivate areas that are not in use, which means you'll use less energy on areas. We've seen some good examples of this, but also starting to require that your system or whatever control system has some sort of environmental reporting. It can be as simple as having monitoring on the power usage on your HVAC system. I personally believe this will be one of the key players in the future in terms of larger corporations having to report on the environmental impacts. And if you can provide them, that might be a really good case.
Sure.
So one of the other things we see is sometimes there are changing regulatory experiences, and one of the suggestions here is basically to make a system for monitoring that's scalable and flexible. So basically, not only regulatory expectation but also customers' expectation. Sometimes we see companies losing deals, GDP companies losing deals because they are not able to extra monitor a very sensitive piece of good because they don't have a system where they can scale up and down the amount of monitoring. For centralized control, basically, if you foresee a future where you want to centralize your control, think about having a cloud-based system or in a system that in somehow can be accessed from anywhere around the world, and also even further, perhaps having a system that it integrates into your building management system already. And then lastly, efficiency of operation. Do you foresee a future where you would like to be more efficient? Maybe that's not a strategic point as much, but basically, do you need a system that integrates directly into a quality system? And we often call this efficient deviation management. So basically, if you know that you'll be using a lot of time on handling temperature deviations, so often typically alarms, right? Something goes out of specifications. How long time can you accept that you will use on gathering the data from the specific system, or downloading it from a system if you have a system that might not support wireless data transfer, gathering all the evidence, the reporting, whatever you need, uploading it back into your system. So thinking about how do we run an efficient operation so that we can start focusing on the quality that actually matters, right? So these are virtual examples. Those are really random examples, but it's just to give you an idea of how we can phrase these things. So basically, for continuous environmental monitoring, so continuous temperature mapping, we can write in the system must support continuous long-term mapping of storage conditions and so forth. And you can read these through. But basically, we should think about how do we achieve the purpose that we want in a user requirement specification. And we've got some other examples for scalable and flexible monitoring. These could be examples such as that the system must allow for adding or removing sensors without affecting validated areas. Like, how do you have a system in which you can add in more sensors for a limited amount of time and remove them again without the sort of the whole system falling apart? You could also, and with the same with the URS 12 here, like new zones, users, or sites must be configurable without system downtime. Do you have a system in which you need to turn off power in order to add another sensor? Well, then you might be less likely to be in order to be scalable and flexible. So just as a last slide here in terms of whether any question, the key takeaways, things I would hope you would remember from today.
Yeah.
First of all, a good URS reflects current needs and future adaptability. Really think about, are you restricting yourself right now writing user requirement specifications that are purely based on what you have right now on your current vendor? Strategic URS thinking leads to long-term compliance and business efficiency. I think that's really, if one thing, that would be the one thing to take away from today, is that, let's be honest, sometimes in a quality position, selling your point of view, especially if you're in a very operational company, can be hard. But communicating the business efficiency of writing good URS, getting those involved, can actually have long-term really good implications on both business and quality.
Yeah.
And then lastly, consider modular, flexible systems that reduce validation burden. So whatever system you choose to employ, either for your HVAC system or for your separation or for your monitoring, whatever it might be, the things should be modular. That's often the way we see people getting the most out of both the monitoring system, but also the whole environmental control system. Relying really heavily on really fixed installations, whether that be the HVAC system or doors and gates, whatever it might be, can have a negative implication.
Yeah.
So. And then, if there are any questions along the way, we do have time for just a few questions here at the end.
While we give you the time for that, and magically you actually made time for questions that can sometimes be a little bit difficult. I have a list now of everybody who answered the question in the beginning correctly. And I believe it's so small on my screen that you can't quite see it. So if you give me a number, Jacob, between 2 and 28, then I should be able to find a winner in here.
19.
So that would be Magdalena from Oslo. That's the winner of
congratulations,
first winner
Magdalena.
ever of UP merchandise, as far as I believe. Congratulations on that. I'll reach out to you and we'll figure out how to get the UP vest your way.
Yeah. So there's a really good question here from Renee. Like, would you add supplier requirements, like products produced according to 9001, to ensure high quality service available within XX hours? Also inside a URS, or are they separately considered as
so much good
buying
vibes and
criteria?
clapping that it's pushing up the question. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Renee. I would say supplier requirements, in my experience, would typically be kept as part of your supply evaluation program. So whilst the way that we would typically structure it is saying, well, if your operational user requirement or your user requirements specifications on the operational topic are that you need to be able to restore power within XX hours. That is your requirement for the specific process. Well, then you go out and you have two options. You can apply, basically you would apply a risk, right? The risk is that the power goes out. Well, you have a user requirement stating that you need to be able to restore power within XX hours. And you could either do that by having a power backup system or having a supplier on call, for example. Well, if you choose the supplier on call, well, and you know that it's 12 hours, well, as part of your vendor or your supplier approval program, you would evaluate whether that supplier would actually be able to fulfill those requirements. And the same thing goes with whether it's products or services, that you need to identify what the requirements are for each specific supplier. So to answer really shortly, I'm sorry, I rarely do things short here. I would keep that as, you mentioned buying criteria or vendor approval program.
If I can add one thing, thinking about these things, then a very simple dumbing it down way of thinking is kind of like a funnel where you have very specific demands or specifications or very broad.
Yeah.
And if you think about whatever you're trying to spec in your URS as in the middle, then try for yourself and with your team to say, okay, if I want the same, but I'll make it less specific going up and more specific going down, what will I get? Just to challenge your own mindset that you're keeping the URS open for, like we talked about, multiple suppliers, different types of solutions for the same thing. You mentioned it could be a vendor or it could be a backup power system. Those might be two of the same things if we go up in terms of how specific we are. So that's just a very low tangible or low key way of doing it, actually.
So just, I think it will be one of the last questions here from John. If you constructed a URS to allow for some flexibility in the HVAC system, for example, and a component such as a rooftop unit needs to be replaced, would the entire space need to be revalidated? Not in terms of the URS, that's my view on it at least, is that you should write a URS for the requirements of the HVAC system. The actual implementation should be any rooftop units or any sort of HVAC system that satisfies those requirements. Where it does have an impact, though, and where we often see it, is that if you have large changes to your control systems, so that would mean, for example, the HVAC system, you would sometimes, as a bare minimum, you need to reassess or review whether you need to perform temperature mapping again. And often you would end up in a situation like this if you choose a different brand or a different capacity or larger changes. Often, also, even though it's the same name and brand and so forth and specification, you would need to requalify or remap there. Thank you, Doris, again. I agree. Second time around, I totally agree with you. It needs to be requalified. You don't need to make another US. If you do, then you were way too specific in your user requirement specification.
And with that, I guess we can say from UPRE, both from Raleigh, North Carolina, and Copenhagen, Denmark, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Jacob, for just taking fires from all directions, questions from all directions here. And thank you to all of you for participating. I think it's the first webinar in a while where we've seen attendance going up even through the Q&A. So we hope it was useful for you guys.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.